Why would armed federal agents storm this small Mojave Desert mine?
They were SWAT guys. They were like a drug raid.
The government says there was an environmental hazard, but the evidence American investigator found points to overzealous bureaucrats.
We had 30 armed people wearing vests and bulletproof vests.
What was the real motive behind the government show of force? Find out the inside story of Operation Desert Stormtroopers.
Tonight on American Investigator, the Mojave Desert, home to Mountain Pass Mine, the Desert Tortoise, and a desert raid.
They were wearing blackjacks. They were SWAT guys. They were like a drug raid.
The government says the mine had created an environmental hazard, but had it?
When I learned that they considered fresh water to be a toxic waste, I was pretty alarmed that the government had gone to that extreme now.
But the endangered desert tortoise also lives in the Mojave, and the government says the mine was a threat.
Everybody that comes out here has to have tortoise training.
So the company paid $1 million for one dead tortoise?
Very expensive tortoise, yes.
What were the results of the tortoise autopsy?
Has the government gone overboard in their attempts to ensure safety?
You know, it's sort of like we're a neighbor, and we want to make sure that everything's going to be healthy.
But how often does a good neighbor call out the Desert Stormtroopers? Tonight on American Investigator. And now, here's the host of American Investigator, Paul Wyrick.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of American Investigator. I'm your host, Paul Wyrick. Tonight we have an exclusive report from California's Mojave Desert, plus your phone calls. We begin our report tonight with Chief Correspondent Scott Wheeler. Scott?
Thanks, Paul. It's bad enough to go to work and be confronted by a hostile boss. But what happens when you're confronted by a hostile U.S. government? When the employees of Molycorp's Mountain Pass Mine arrived for work on what should have been a typical September Tuesday in 1996, they were not expecting trouble.
They stopped at the gate, and the guard, he wasn't going to let him in. The guy threatened to pull a gun on him. He let him in.
But trouble is precisely what they got, and there was no sense calling the police for help since the intruders themselves wielded a badge and a warrant. The armed government agents called it a document search, but mine employees had a different description.
You know, I've always referred to it as the raid. That's what it felt like. That's what it appeared if you were there. You know, we had 30 armed people wearing vests and bulletproof vests.
The tiny desert mining town of Mountain Pass is so sparsely populated it doesn't show up on most California state maps. It's in the Mojave Desert, and it's the site of Molycorp's Mountain Pass Mine.
These are honest, hard-working people trying to do an honest day's work, producing an essential product for this country.
Mountain Pass Mine is the only U.S. producer of lanthanides. Lanthanides are minerals used in the manufacture of essential goods ranging from communications and electronics devices to aircraft parts and floor tile. Even the catalytic converters in our cars use lanthanides to process unleaded gasoline in an environmentally friendly manner. Murray Page is an independent chemical engineer familiar with Molycorp's lanthanide mining operation.
What would happen if lanthanides weren't available anywhere in the world?
Well, certainly there would have to be some significant changes in some of the basic things we use today and take for granted. Not to say that eventually science wouldn't find ways around it, but these elements are a significant piece of the periodic table. And to take them away from industry would be a significant handicap.
The small town and the small mine probably would have continued about their business unmolested had it not been for the California Desert Protection Act of 1994. This bill, pushed through Congress by California Senator Dianne Feinstein and Representative George Miller, declared the lands around the Mountain Pass mine protected public lands. This effectively gave the Department of Interior home field advantage when dealing with the mine, since Molycorp's wastewater pipe passes through a small portion of the newly protected Mojave Desert before reaching its destination in an evaporation pool owned by the mine. Experts say Molycorp is a good steward of the government-controlled land that surrounds the mine.
I think they've operated the mine very responsibly. And of course, they're not surrounded by a large population center because they're in the middle of the California desert. But certainly there is no evidence that they treat the environment in any way other than great respect.
But in the summer of 1996, a wastewater pipe burst during routine maintenance while being flushed with fresh water. Thousands of gallons of water spilled into the government-protected land where the parched ground absorbed it a short distance from where it should have drained and evaporated into the desert air. A month later, a coalition of armed government agents, including representatives from the Bureau of Land Management, arrived at Molycorp's gates. Molycorp employee Steve Johnson recalls.
It was a SWAT-type raid. They were wandering around all over the place, and they were wearing flak jacks. They were SWAT guys. They were like a drug raid, and they were armed.
And some had DA written on them, and some had federal agent emblazoned on their vests. And they had their guns out.
We also spoke with Susan Messler, Molycorp's former accounting clerk.
Was anybody at the mine armed?
Oh, none of the employees were, because it's a mine and by federal regulation there's no firearms allowed.
So the only people with guns were...
Right, were the government, right.
Guns weren't the only thing the mine employees weren't allowed to have. They couldn't have lawyers either.
And they got to the gate and they were rejected and not allowed onto the property by the federal agents standing there.
So the federal agents would not let the corporate attorneys come in and counsel their...
Right. We were not allowed to speak to our attorneys to get any guidance as to what our rights were at the time.
The government agents rounded up Susan Messler and other mine employees and herded them into a conference room. After a few hours, many had to go to the bathroom, for which they needed special permission.
And the first few people who were allowed out then were followed to the bathroom to make sure that's where they were going. My first guess was that they were looking for some serious crimes that might have been committed, and I was thinking of maybe they were looking for drugs or some, information to that extent.
But they weren't looking for guns or drugs, just information about the water pipe break from the month before.
And when I heard later that they were looking for computer records regarding a break on the pipeline, I thought they'd gone a little overboard in the way they executed the search warrant.
So were you astonished when you learned that this was all over a freshwater spill in the desert?
When I learned that they consider fresh water to be a toxic waste, I was pretty alarmed that the government had gone to that extreme now.
Trying to make sense of why the government would launch an all-out assault on a company that mines products essential to the economy while also maintaining a good environmental record, American investigators spoke with former Molycorp project engineer Harold Gibson, whose duties included the wastewater discharge system.
So you have personal knowledge that Molycorp filed the correct paperwork with each spill.
And each time there was a reportable spill.
A claim the government does not dispute.
Who were they required to notify?
They notified all the required agencies that they were supposed to. I think there might
We spoke with representatives of the Bureau of Land Management. The BLM is responsible for coordinating the many government agencies monitoring the cleanup site. The BLM claims they just want to ensure that there are no health risks from the soil, which they say absorbed hazardous pipe residue and wastewater in the area of the desert spill.
This is the personal protective equipment with air purifying respirators. The air is purified as it goes in. There's no...
The BLM says this type of equipment is necessary in order to safely monitor the cleanup. But mine employees who work around lanthanide byproducts every day told American Investigator That's a joke.
So when you see one of the federal agents wearing goggles, a respirator, the white moon suits, and booties,
He's playing the part.
he's just playing the part.
That's all he's doing, guaranteed.
How dangerous was this spill?
People in the chem plant work around this water all the time.
Did they wear any special protective gear while they're working around it?
Normally, they aren't wearing any kind of protective gear.
The mine employees work around this material all the time. Do they wear any protective gear?
No. Even the ones who repair it, which would be mostly the plumbers, they never wore any protective equipment like that.
American investigator asked the BLM for their assessment of the danger posed by the spill.
It's possible that there's no severe human risk from this. We have not conducted the studies. We don't have the information to tell us what, if anything, over the long term would be a risk to human health and safety. And basically, we didn't feel there was an acute health hazard.
Were there any laws broken by Molycorp?
In effect, it wasn't breaking law. It was that it becomes a matter of complying with the law when those things occur.
Since no parties involved are insisting that any immediate danger existed from the wastewater spill and no laws were broken, many are wondering why the government demanded immediate action.
We issued them a notice of noncompliance for having that spill and ordered them to clean it up and to act immediately.
But the BLM admits Molycorp was in fact ready to begin the cleanup before any government agencies got involved.
Yeah, I think Molycorp was very anxious to get it done.
Yet at least 9 months passed without any action being taken to clean up the spill.
Why didn't the company clean up this spill?
That was all the government agencies. We were stopped from doing any kind of cleanup, which we normally would have done, to investigate the spill. We weren't allowed on the property, weren't allowed to clean up, and it's been more than a year. I'm not sure if they've been allowed to clean it up yet.
Molycorp was required to submit a cleanup plan which would meet the criteria of each and every government agency involved.
So it was the government's own regulations, essentially, that prevented the cleanup?
Right. It was the government agencies wanted to be certain that how the cleanup was going to be handled with this cleanup plan that caused the immediate cleanup from not occurring.
So Molycorp wanted to begin cleaning up right away, but they were bogged down by regulations?
Yes, a long period of time went by, and I think everybody looks bad here. You know, nobody looks good for not having initiated it sooner.
Why wouldn't the government just let Molycorp clean up the site?
A good question, because they don't care if it's cleaned up or not. they don't care. The spill is not a problem. They know that. They're using this as a place to just squeeze the mine a little bit tighter, and eventually they'll regulate us out of business.
The government has drawn a line in the sand, and it's around this mine. In the past, Molycorp has readily invited the press to inspect the mine, pointing out that most experts agree their environmental record is exemplary. But now they've locked us out, fearing that an interview with American Investigator would only antagonize those government agencies who have the power to shut them down.
They're jumping through the hoops, they're bending over backwards, they're doing everything they can do to please the people, but they don't understand it. They don't care if they do all these regulations. The agencies don't care.
To continue tonight's story, here is investigative reporter Mark Moreno. Mark?
Thanks, Paul. It turns out there are many reasons why the Mojave Desert cleanup has still not been completed. Let's take a look. The government readily admits that the cleanup process has dragged on too long. Many believe there's a pattern here. They say the government seems more interested in regulatory oversight and levying fines than in simply getting the job done.
They're trying to collect as much as they can on fines, so invariably when one of these agencies comes on site, you know, there's going to be some kind of fine because they got to pay for their trip out there for that day.
So how many government agencies have made the trip out to Molycorp? We spoke with John Key, the Federal Bureau of Land Management, or BLM's incident commander at the cleanup site. Key is coordinating all of the federal, state, and local agencies that are participating in the cleanup. We asked him for a rundown of the agencies involved.
Bureau of Land Management and National Park Service are land management agencies. The releases occurred on their property, so we're involved. The Fish and Wildlife Service for the endangered species. The California Department of Fish and Game is responsible for all off-highway releases. The California Department of Health Services Radiological Health Branch. The California, two agencies of Cal EPA. The Lahontan Regional Water Quality Control Board.
But that's not all.
The county, the Department of Toxic Substances Control is involved, as well as all their supporting staff. San Bernardino County Fire Hazardous Materials Division. County Planning?
And County Planning.
County Planning's involved because they are responsible for the permitting of the mine because it's on private land.
There's more.
Like today, the Water Board has a representative here today.
There's also the Environmental Protection Agency, Air Resources Control Board, the Mojave Air Quality Management District, Local Enforcement Agency, National Resource Applied Science Center, the State Water Resources Control Board,
same with radiological health. It depends on what kind of activities are going on.
And
the real
Bureau of Indian Affairs, they've been consulted.
The total on all, there's 28 agencies involved?
There's about 29 agencies.
29. So what kind of working conditions are created when some 29 federal, state, and local government agencies are involved?
Well, one of the big challenges here was that there were so many different agencies involved, and it was difficult both for us, the agencies, to work with each other. We didn't really know each other's rules and regulations that well.
It's very interesting because each agency has their own rules and regulations, and they often, sometimes they conflict a little, sometimes they overlap. So it's always interesting.
Well, I think the
Murray Page is less charitable in describing this concentration of 29 government agencies.
I think common sense would say that the process is slowed down. The regulations and the method of implementing those regulations appears to be overly bureaucratic and does not seem in the end to be in the best interests of the American public.
Are 29 federal, state, and local government agencies necessary to clean up a spill? The government agencies argue it is vital to clean up the spill by the book. With all of this concern, you might think the government is worried about the potential danger to the nearby human population. The only problem is, there is no nearby human population. There is, however, this little guy, the desert tortoise. The government is concerned that Molycorp's spills might harm him, and he was listed as an endangered species in 1989. If a species is considered to be in danger of extinction, the Endangered Species Act gives it federal protection. Herpetologist Alex Heindel.
Sorts of studies. People begin to look at the animal because all of a sudden you have to deal with it. It is an animal that has suddenly become protected by federal law, so you have to deal with it.
The Mojave National Preserve, adjacent to Molycorp's mine, was created in 1994 in large part because it's considered to be prime desert tortoise habitat. The Endangered Species Act carries a host of civil and criminal penalties for anyone who violates its provisions, a fact of which Molycorp is now well aware. Sue Messler told American Investigator how Molycorp's fate was altered one day when
a dead tortoise was found within the property of the mine, and because we found it, we did report it, as we're required to the agencies.
Government officials came to the site and conducted an autopsy.
What were the results of the tortoise autopsy?
They never did find any conclusive evidence that anybody at the company had anything to do with this tortoise.
That didn't stop the government from levying fines, however, expensive fines.
Total fines and costs to protect the tortoise was just over $1 million. So the people at the mine termed it our million dollar tortoise.
So the company paid $1 million for one dead tortoise?
Very expensive tortoise, yes.
We have to take a break, but there's more American Investigator after this.
More about the $1 million tortoise coming up.
Welcome back to American Investigator. With more on the desert tortoise, reporter Mark Morano. Mark?
Thanks, Paul. Molycorp's $1 million tortoise may have been the first big problem for the mine, but it wasn't the last. Take a look. The $1 million tortoise was only the beginning of Molycorp's tortoise woes. The September 1996 armed government raid was led by California Fish and Game and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, enforcers of the Endangered Species Act. This act triggered a number of changes for Molycorp and its employees. Alan Stein of the BLM.
The tortoise and concerns for the tortoise are brought up at the beginning and the close of every day's operations. Everybody that comes out here has to have tortoise training.
The official term is Desert Tortoise Worker Education Class, although Molycorp's employees referred to it as
Desert Tortoise Sensitivity Training.
And what exactly is this training?
Well, tortoise training is basically to heighten people's awareness of the tortoise and what they need to look for, what they can and can't do.
There were a number of things Molycorp's employees could no longer do. They could no longer drive faster than 15 miles per hour, while maintaining a 100-foot separation between vehicles. They could no longer operate heavy equipment without the monitoring of authorized government biologists, hired at company expense, who made sure no tortoises were in their way. Tortoise fencing was erected to keep the desert tortoise out of harm's way. Additionally, a government detail of armed security agents were hired to patrol the cleanup site 24 hours a day. In practical terms, the tortoise regulations hit Molycorp hard. Harold Gibson told American Investigator what happened when a tortoise was spotted on site.
If need be, you stop work and move away from your equipment until that tortoise leaves.
You stop work and wait for a tortoise?
If you found a tortoise under a piece of equipment when you come to work, you don't operate that piece of equipment until the tortoise is gone.
That could take literally hours.
We came across at least 1 or 2 tortoises every day during this project, and wherever that tortoise was, we would just close that area.
The Endangered Species Act prohibits anyone except government-authorized biologists to come near a tortoise. This means that for the rest of us, the consequences of simply trying to prevent a tortoise from crossing a highway can be staggering. U.S. Fish and Wildlife says that moving or even touching a desert tortoise is considered a take. The penalty for a take? Up to $75,000 in fines and even a year in prison.
Better let the tortoise be run over by a truck.
Philippe de Vaugelis is the publisher of Vivarium magazine. A reptiles and amphibians expert, de Vaugelis is concerned with preserving endangered species, yet finds himself increasingly at odds with the endangered species laws and wildlife regulations. In light of all the laws protecting the desert tortoise, what would you advise someone who saw a tortoise about to cross the highway?
Normally, I would say don't touch it because the cost of doing so on a personal level could be great. Certainly financially and legally, there would be a great cost involved.
De Vaugelis maintains that the enforcement of the Endangered Species Act focuses too much on strict adherence to regulations.
There is this tendency to punish and prosecute rather than finding any kind of reasonable balance or reasonable solutions.
The endangered species regulations even forbid the touching of an empty shell of a dead tortoise.
If this shell had come from a wild tortoise, to possess it without a permit from the Fish and Wildlife Service would be a violation of the Endangered Species Act.
How do you get a permit to get the dead shell?
You better have a lot of time on your hands because you would basically have to petition the Fish and Wildlife Service to give you a permit to possess an endangered species.
If I went through this lengthy procedure, what's the likelihood they would allow me to keep the shell?
My guess is they'd reject it unless you could show a really compelling reason why you should be allowed to have it.
Molycorp's struggle to satisfy 29 federal, state, and local government agencies has revealed the extent of what can be referred to as the Desert Tortoise Support Network. This includes desert tortoise sensitivity training, tortoise autopsies, government-certified biological monitors, 15-mile-an-hour speed limits with separation between vehicles, tortoise fencing, severe criminal penalties for harming or harassing a desert tortoise, and even armed government raids on behalf of the tortoise. Additionally, there's an official tortoise adoption agency which places tortoises that cannot be returned to the wild into suitable homes. And there's a tortoise board, an agency which administers a $500 per acre tortoise tax. So just how is the desert tortoise doing, considering all the restrictions on human activity? Actually, one of the main threats to the tortoise isn't human at all. It's a bird, the common raven.
What it does is it flies down and it pokes through the shell and basically eats the tortoise.
Which raises the question, couldn't the raven be hunted to eliminate such an obvious threat?
But they can't be killed. They're protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act.
But does the federal government really consider the desert tortoise as a species to be threatened? Surprisingly, no. If I were to find a desert tortoise here in the Mojave National Preserve, it would have the full weight and protection of the United States federal government behind it. If I were to find the same tortoise east of the Colorado River, it would have no more rights than anybody else. The desert tortoise threatened status only applies to the Mojave population. The other two-thirds of the desert tortoise population, those east of the Colorado River, are not threatened. And it's the same animal.
They're both Gopherus agassizii, the desert tortoise.
Not only is the desert tortoise as a species not threatened, the Mojave population itself is actually thriving.
And it's far greater numbers than we thought there would be, and there were a lot of young tortoises.
Even U.S. Fish and Wildlife acknowledged that there were more tortoises than they initially believed.
So any numbers that may have been available relative to the density are probably out of date based on our experience out here.
If the desert tortoise is not threatened as a species, and there are more tortoises than anyone expected, have government agencies overreacted in the name of the desert tortoise? Despite the many wildlife regulations, Devojali believes that endangered species are not even the primary concern.
Basically, better to uphold the law than to really save animals, because it's not the animals that are primary concern. The law is becoming a primary concern, and implementing the law becomes a primary concern.
Do you think the Mountain Pass mine situation is an aberration or part of an increasing trend?
It appears to be increasing. I can only tell.
Devojali's organization, the American Federation of Herpetoculturists, reports many similar armed federal raids by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service into homes with exotic reptiles and amphibians. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a history of these type of raids?
There have been those types of raids where, yes, they knock at your door, they do have guns. And there's one recently that occurred in Oklahoma, and where the individual was afraid they were going to shoot his dog. This happened recently. Well, there was a man in Colorado who was raided and was also threatened with having the IRS investigating him, and was threatened with losing his license, his veterinary license in this case. They do have DEA-type authority when dealing with wildlife.
Devojali is not optimistic about the future.
But what is going to happen as time goes on and you have more and more endangered species, more and more things that need funds for recovery, more and more people that might be prosecuted, where does this all go? What is the end cost to the American public? And is this what our culture wants?
We may not know the cost to the American public yet, but to find out what the cost has been to Molycorp, stay tuned.
Coming up, if Molycorp goes under, where will the U.S. get their lanthanides? The surprising answer next.
Welcome back to American Investigator. Scott Wheeler is here to conclude our report. Scott?
Thanks, Paul. The price Molycorp paid for the many government agencies and regulations is higher than one might think. Let's take a look. We asked the Bureau of Land Management if Molycorp was picking up all the costs associated with the desert tortoise and the desert cleanup.
Yes, and they've estimated the cost to date at about $6.2 million.
These regulations were instituted to help save the endangered desert tortoise, but now it may be Mountain Pass Mine which faces extinction.
We, the BLM, are very interested because we're a neighbor. You know, it's sort of like we're a neighbor, and we want to make sure that everything's going to be healthy.
But what is the cost of the government's good intentions? According to Susan Messler, Molycorp's former accounting clerk, the $6.2 million in fines crippled the company.
We probably didn't make that much money in a 5-year period. Probably would make $6 million. I think probably the profits were much lower than that each year.
Is it fair to say that people lost their jobs due to this environmental clampdown?
That definitely was part of the reason why.
Since the 1996 government raid on Molycorp, the mine has been forced to lay off 1/3 of the mine's nearly 300 employees, and Molycorp officials say that number is expected to rise.
It seemed that way to me, that there was somebody with an agenda out there that had nothing to do with the pipeline, and they were just using that to further their own agenda of some sort.
If there is an agenda, it probably has more to do with the California Democrats, Senator Dianne Feinstein and Congressman George Miller, the authors of the California Desert Protection Act. American Investigator has obtained these. Secretary Bruce Babbitt in 1997, excoriating Molycorp over the pipeline incident and demanding harsh penalties against the mine. With that kind of political force in play, it comes as no surprise that there's more trouble ahead. American Investigator has learned that Molycorp is about to face criminal indictments, and it's all due to the water spills in the desert, in which a mine-initiated cleanup was halted for nearly a year by the government agencies. Experts wonder if the government has considered the consequences of forcing the only source of lanthanides in the United States out of business.
So what would happen if lanthanides were not available from the Molycorp mine? Would the United States just do without them, or?
No, I don't think industry would do without them. I think they're too important. I think what would happen, we would end up importing them, probably from China.
Who's your biggest competition here in the United States?
The Molycorp. Molycorp is our competitor. Yeah.
Meet Weiji Ku of Baotou Rare Earths, a communist Chinese company. If Molycorp goes out of business, Baotou stands to gain control over the entire U.S. market for lanthanides.
You think Molycorp will go out of business?
I think probably, yeah, probably, yeah. Yeah, I think probably, yeah.
Mr. Ku is so confident that Molycorp will go under that he's already opened up this office in San Francisco.
I think in the future, my company will become the important the rare earth producer in the world. Yeah.
So the company wants to become the most important rare earth producer in the world?
Yeah, yeah.
And even in the United States?
Right, correct, yeah.
Baotou Rare Earths Company is well on their way to achieving that goal. After the government raid on Molycorp, Molycorp's production fell by 17%, the exact amount Baotou's production rose.
Is it safe to assume that Molycorp has to experience a lot more government regulation from the U.S. government than Baotou Mine does from the Chinese government?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah. Because Baotou, because our company is a state-owned company, yeah, belongs to the government.
Your company probably doesn't have to worry about endangered species laws?
It will be decided by our top management. Yeah.